Hey pals, I'm here today to chat about the 9 books that I've recently read and haven't reviewed yet. So, in all honesty, when I was sort of looking through these books, I was putting them in order of least and most favourite, I realised that it's been kind of unsuccessful. I think there's only really 3 books out of these 9 that I'm really glad I read. And other than that, there's a few that ended up being a waste of my time, and then a couple kind of in the middle somewhere where I enjoyed elements and then had problems with other elements. So yeah, and what you'll see links a lot of these books, all of these books I think, is that they're all books that have been released within the last year. In fact, 8 of the 9 I think have been released in 2024. And I've said recently in my mid-year check-in video that I felt I was leaning too heavily into new releases. I find it exciting to, as someone who likes making lists, it's fun to keep up to date with new content because there's these constant new lists you can make, right? And also, as someone who has a channel like this, I always get excited about being able to be part of a conversation about a new release that could end up being a really buzzy book where loads of people are talking about it, and that's kind of exciting and fun. And it happens more with new releases than it does with books that have been out for a while. So I think I end up getting pulled in by that, and that's something I really want to try and stop doing, because even though I've enjoyed reading in the last month, looking back, a lot of these books have just ended up being kind of mediocre or less than, and that isn't what I want my reading to be. So you're going to hear me rant a little bit because these first few I didn't really enjoy at all. So the first one, sadly, is Winter Animals by Ashani Lewis. This is a debut novel, came out January 2024, and I've been excited about it since then and have finally got around to reading it. Now, I mentioned this in my most recent currently reading video over on Patreon, and I was halfway through and I was enjoying it. And I was kind of a little bit surprised because this book has an average rating of 3.10 on Storygraph, which is very low. And so I was prepared for the ending to maybe not be that successful because of that, and that is what ended up happening, very sadly, because I did really quite enjoy the first half. So the premise of this is that we are following a 38-year-old woman who lives in a ski town in North America somewhere, can't remember where. Her husband ups and leaves her, he just disappears, and she can't afford the rent in the house that she lives in, so she isn't really sure what to do. She's had a problem with alcohol for a while, and she is in a bar outside of town drinking, and she bumps into these 4 people in their early 20s, 2 guys, 2 girls, or young women, I should say, and they are super wealthy from historic wealth and super posh and eccentric, and they're basically being ski bums. They are travelling around the world to ski resorts that are out of season, so they have the slopes free, and they're breaking into abandoned hotels and Airbnbs and squatting. And they invite her along, and she decides to join them. And this book follows a couple of month period where she's with them, and yeah, things feel a bit off. This book has references, people who've blurbed it have said it's kind of reminiscent of The Secret History of Madonna Tartt. I think that gets mentioned a lot. I kind of see that in terms of, there's this building sense of dread of the fact that there could be some kind of cruelty behind the veneer of privilege of these young people. And also, it's kind of got that setting that elements of The Secret History have, of this kind of snow-capped mountains and stuff. Issue of this book is I think in the first half the tension builds really well. She's a character that's kind of unknowable, unlikable, I think is probably too strong a word, and she's kind of letting things happen to her, which I think is often the type of character we get to see these types of stories through. And yeah, there's this sense of being unsettled and unsure, which I really liked, and I thought the discussions about wealth and privilege were well handled. I don't want to spoil anything about this book, so I'm not going to talk about a kind of central element of it because it isn't revealed right at the start. But my feelings to this book were that the final third was much weaker. When I finished it, I read the last 50 pages in one sitting, and I threw it on the floor and said, "What a load of pretentious wank," to Johnny. And that's pretty much how I felt towards the end. It doesn't really go anywhere, it gets super pretentious. there's a scene where they have like an acid trip together, and the writing becomes kind of more cerebral and hallucinatory after that. You're not really sure what's happening, and I just felt frustrated and let down by it. So I wouldn't recommend this one, and I was really gutted because it started out quite strong for me. And the next one, and this is entirely different in terms of my reasons for not really enjoying it, is In Memory of Us by Jacqueline Roy. I just found this entirely forgettable. Again, this came out early 2024, and this book is set in the present day, and we are following one half of a set of British twins. I believe their father was part of the Windrush generation and their mother was white, so they grew up mixed race in England at the time of like Enoch Powell's speech and things like that, so a really difficult time to be a person of colour in England. And when it opens in the present day, one of these women is an old lady, and she is clearly struggling with dementia that she's trying to sort of hide from her caregivers. And she gets back in contact with an old friend and is trying to find out what happened to her sister and what happened in the past between them all, and is kind of getting confused. So lots of sections of the book are what happened in the past, kind of from the moment of them being like 10-year-olds, I think. And you slowly start to piece together what happened in the past and the kind of reasons that our protagonist is a bit confused. And I just found this book, the writing was just fine, everything was kind of just fine. I think it was maybe a bit too simple for me. The themes were handled in entirely the way you would expect. The plot went where I thought it would go, and I think the book was overly long for the character work and the themes it was exploring. So this was just one of those books that I think will be quite forgettable for me. This has pretty high ratings over on Storygraph and Goodreads, so I think it's just more that I'm not the right reader for this book. So if you like the sound of it, definitely go look into it, because I think this is more of a preference thing for me as a reader than it is a problem with the actual book. Then for my Patreon book club in June, we read Whalefall by Elizabeth O'Connor. This is a very short novel. It's only a couple of hundred pages and there's not a lot of text to the page. This is set in a small island off the coast of Wales in 1938. There is only about 60 inhabitants, and at the start of the book we are following it through the eyes of a young woman, I think she's 18 or 19, called Manod. At the start of the book, two academics arrive to kind of study the culture of the people on the island. She gets tangled up with them because she speaks quite good English, and most of the people on the island can only speak Welsh. And yeah, this book is kind of a commentary on outsiders coming in and kind of romanticising communities that live separately, perhaps live more traditionally, and perhaps from outsiders would be viewed as more old-fashioned and kind of quaint, and how they can be misrepresented, and how all that's kind of tied up with, like the empire and colonialism and things like that. And I found that this book was pretty much dealing with the same themes as The Colony by Audrey McGee, but in a lot less space. This book is incredibly plotless. There's not a ton of depth with the character work. Very well written if you like descriptions of nature and landscapes. This definitely does that well, and it has kind of an atmosphere to go with that. Again, I just think this type of book doesn't work for me. It's way too slight, it feels too vignette-y. It feels like it is quite kind of broad strokes and you have to fill in all the gaps. And I just kind of read it and didn't feel much for it. So again, I think for some readers this will be a wonderful book. For me, it was just too slight. Then I listened on audio to The Age of Magical Overthinking, Notes on Modern Irrationality by Amanda Montell, narrated by the author. And I previously listened to Cultish by this author when it came out a couple of years ago, and I really enjoyed it. I found it a real binge listen. So I was intrigued by this one. This was a really kind of odd listen because, and this is going to be quite hard to talk about, so I will give it my best shot. I feel the biggest problem I have with this book is it doesn't know what it's setting out to do. I'm not quite sure what the thesis of this book is. It says in the blurb that it's a delicious blend of cultural criticism and personal narrative that explores our cognitive biases and the power, disadvantages and highlights of magical thinking. Magical thinking can be broadly defined as the belief that one's internal thoughts can affect unrelated events in the external think of the conviction that one can manifest their way out of poverty, stave off cancer with positive vibes, thwart the apocalypse by learning to can their own peaches, or transform an unhealthy relationship to a glorious one with loyalty alone, which sort of summarises some of the chapters in this book. I think this book is a collection of things Amanda Montell found interesting and wanted to talk about and kind of tried to link together somewhat. There were nuggets in here that I found interesting. I find, and this is where I think I just need to lean more into the type of books that discuss this more in depth. I found some of the studies that she referenced about human behaviour and especially about cognitive biases. I found that really interesting, but it was surrounded by a lot of meandering. This one feels much more like a memoir compared to Cultish. She talks about a lot of her own life, which I don't think really added much. And it felt a little bit kind of like it was maybe cherry picking. It felt like it was quite surface level on a lot of the topics. And yeah, just the message was kind of confused. So this was okay. I did not enjoy it. But by the halfway point, I had to keep going to the blurb and being like, what is this book supposed to be about? Because I can't see like a through thread with this one. So yeah, there's my feelings on that. Then we have This Is How You Remember It by Katherine Prasivka. This is her second novel. And this was kind of an odd one for me. I think I also maybe spoke about this in a currently reading video over on my Patreon. And at one point I was considering DNFing this book just because it was such a true reflection of what it was writing about that I felt very, very depressed by it. And I mean that as a positive rather than a critique. So this book is in second person, which I don't think I've read many books that are in second person. And it opens with a young girl who I think is around the age of 8 on a family holiday, and they have the first video camera. And it's about how she starts to perceive her sense of self and her body differently once she can sort of watch herself back. And it then follows her through her childhood and adolescence, and it watches her life through the lens of sort of technology and the internet and social media and how all those things negatively affect her perception of her self-worth and who she really is, and in particular her perception of her body. And so the first half of this I found like so true to what it was like to grow up in that period. I was trying to work out if I would have been a similar age to this protagonist. I think perhaps she would have been a bit younger than me, so her access to the internet would have been like higher. Does that make sense? I was born in 1990, so we got our first computer when I was 9. But I don't even know if I was really ever allowed to go on. I don't think I was allowed to go on the internet. I think I remember I had a Lion King game, which was to teach you to type properly. And you were Timon and Pumbaa and bugs were falling and you had to type properly to like eat the bugs. And that was pretty much what I spent my time on the computer doing. So I think we had a kind of different relationship, but this is about someone whose relationship with the internet was super unmonitored and resulted in like just really awful negative things. And there is sort of something that happens in the book that I don't want to spoil, that was kind of hinted at on the blurb. And then, there's a shift. So I was considering DNFing it when I read the first half, not because I thought it was badly written, but because it was just really fucking depressing and really reminded me of how cruel children and teenagers can be to one another, in particular girls. And I just felt pretty bleak reading it. But I was like, no, I'm going to persevere because it's a good book and I'm just struggling with it. And then the book really shifts, maybe the final 2/5, and it becomes, it's about her time at university, and it becomes much more of there's kind of like a romance, a will they, won't they, and it's still linked to her feelings about her body and that kind of trauma related to that, but it becomes a much more, I don't know, not so depressing, and kind of the focus feels a little bit different. So I'd say this book is a book of two halves. On the one hand, I think it was really successful at sort of capturing the feeling of that era for a teenager. On the other hand, I think it was at times fairly heavy-handed with that. In particular, I won't spoil anything, but the protagonist has a younger brother and he gets really wrapped up in the online community. And I think where his story went was like pretty, a bit too exaggerated, a bit too like simplified. in terms of relationship with the internet. So yeah, this was a mixed bag for me. I'd probably look into what she wrote in the future. I think if you like the sound of this one, give it a go. But just be aware that it's kind of bleak, especially in that first half. And we have The Alternatives by Keelan Hughes. This is, I think, this author's third novel, and I've been interested in her previous novels and just not got around to reading them. But this is the one with the premise that most interests me. I'm just double checking the blurb to just check that I'm not sort of spoiling anything. I think this is a book that's kind of difficult to spoil because it's much more about its themes than it is anything else. The premise of this book is that we follow 4 adult Irish sisters who live in different parts of the world. One of them lives in Connecticut, one of them lives in Notting Hill, and then 2 of them still live in Ireland, I think, but different parts of Ireland. So the 4 sisters haven't come together in many years. As children, both their parents died in kind of a tragic accident, sort of, on the same night. And the elder sister ended up raising the other sisters. And when the book opens, that elder sister, who is an academic who specialises in geology, teaches a lecture in geology to her first years, goes home, spends the evening with her loving husband and stepsons, and then goes to bed, gets up in the middle of the night, drinks some gin, gets on a bike and leaves, and doesn't come back. And doesn't tell anyone where she's gone, and just disappears with nothing other than like her phone and her wallet. And this book is about her 3 sisters coming together in the Irish countryside to go and find her. And it says this in the blurb, and you know, this all happens quite early on. They do find her in a cottage in the Irish countryside, and the majority of the book is set in that cottage and focused around their kind of conversations as they try and figure out why she's just abandoned her life. Now, this book was an interesting one, and I think it would have been cool to be part of a book club for this book, because I think this book has a lot to say. And at points I was really enjoying this book, and it was on track to be like a 4-star read. And then there was a period in the book where there was a bit of a lull, and it felt a little bit stagnant. I saw that in a lot of reviews as well, so I think a lot of people felt that. And then I think, yeah, the ending sort of tied it together quite well again. But as I said, this book is much more a novel of ideas than it is anything else. And so I think the character work is quite strong. You really get to know each of the sisters. All 4 of them have PhDs. One of them is an honorary PhD, but you know, it's obviously quite rare for 4 siblings that all have PhDs. They're all incredibly skilled and intelligent in their field. And yeah, 3 of them are academics. And so there's points in this novel where I found that I didn't really know what the hell they were talking about. In particular, one of the sisters. So one of the sisters is an academic in philosophy, which is just something I hate reading about. And she sort of discussed a lot of kind of thought experiments. I didn't mind, but didn't love it. The geologist I was fine with because I studied geology at A-level. And then one of them, and I can't even remember or put into words what she specialises in, but it was something to do with like people from the community forming a committee that would be part of like discussing and creating government legislature. So they'd have a voice, and it's about, she sort of researches that and promotes that. And there was a lot of talk about that I kind of found a bit like confused. So I think this is one of those books, kind of like Burnham Wood by Eleanor Catton, where you can tell the author has done like a ton of research in what these characters are knowledgeable about, and then isn't very forgiving in the type of conversations these characters have about that topic. I was fine with it in Burnham Wood, but in this I did struggle somewhat and just felt a bit stupid. On the other hand, I kind of enjoyed the relationships and where this went, but yeah, I do think it meandered a little bit. And yeah, so this ended up being probably like a 3.5-star read for me. I think if you're interested in it, and probably if you're like more knowledgeable about politics and philosophy, you might enjoy this more than I did. But yeah, I'm interested enough that I'd probably still give one of our other novels a go. And the one thing I should say about this is this book is kind of formally interesting in that each chapter is kind of from the perspective of one of the sisters, I think in third person, but kind of centres them. But a lot of the chapters are written like a screenplay, so they're just dialogue, and then there's these sections with like the stage directions. Those sections are much more detailed than real stage directions would be, which was kind of confusing because it's like, if you want to go for this form, then that's cool, but then like you still want to give us more detail than this form really allows. You're sort of breaking the form. And then, yeah, I just wasn't quite sure whether it made sense to do that. I think it's because she wanted this book to be really dialogue heavy. And so that worked in that sense. And I love dialogue, so I was kind of fine with that. But I was somewhat confused by when she decided to use that form and when she didn't. And I'm not sure if it entirely worked, but I thought it was interesting anyway. Then a book that came out quite recently that I think lots of people will be talking about soon because it was a really enjoyable read is Evenings and Weekends by Oisin McKenna. This, was an interesting book. This is about a group of characters who are all somehow linked together. Let me see if I remember them. We have a woman in her early 30s, I think, who has just found out that she's pregnant unexpectedly, and she loves her life in central London but can't really afford to raise a child there. So with her boyfriend, they are considering moving back to the area they grew up in, which is sort of on the outskirts of London. So you're following her story, you're following her boyfriend's story, who is sort of questioning his future and questioning his sexuality. His girlfriend's best friend, Phil, sees him do something he shouldn't in a men's bathroom. And then the best friend, Phil, is in a relationship with a man who is in an open relationship with another man. But he's falling in love with this guy, so he's like, I don't really want him to be in an open relationship. I don't really want to tell him that. And he's got unresolved trauma to do with sexual assault. And then you're also following his mother, who you know from the off has just been diagnosed with cancer, but hasn't yet told Phil. And then there's a couple of peripheral characters, I think, but I think they're the people who you follow. This is all set over one weekend in 2019 in London. It was a June, or it was like the hottest June on record. And basically, the weekend kind of centres around you knowing these three kind of secrets. One being that Maggie is pregnant. One being that her boyfriend was seen doing something in a men's bathroom that he shouldn't have been. And one being that Phil's mother has cancer. And you know these things. Some other characters know these things, but the people who should know them don't. So plot-wise, it's about, oh shit, is it going to be revealed to that person by the wrong person in the wrong way? Like, how is this going to go down? And the weekend is building up to a house party where a lot of these characters will come together, and there's going to be a lot of drink and drugs, and so, you're unsure how this is all going to go down. I found this incredibly readable. And when I was reading this, I thought, and I'm not sure if this is like a fair comparison, so I'd be interested to know if other people have read this and felt similarly. I kind of felt that, so Jacqueline Wilson is a children's book author, very famous and successful in the UK, and I loved her books as a child and young teen. But she's bringing out her first adult novel later this year, and I can't wait. And I was feeling like, I feel like this would be kind of the story Jacqueline Wilson would write for adults. And I don't know if that's just because I know she's bringing out a novel for adults soon, but this story really centred the type of characters she centred in her stories for children, in that a lot, most of these characters are sort of struggling financially. In particular, Maggie and her boyfriend are really on the edge of poverty and just cannot afford the lives they want to have in London. Most of these characters are queer and are kind of trying to deal with that. A lot of them have unresolved trauma to do with their bodies and are sort of questioning their identity. So I think there's really interesting discussions at play here about class and gender and sexuality. And I feel like that's the type of thing Jacqueline Wilson will do as an adult writer. And it just had that feel to it of, I don't know, just the way the kind of momentum felt recognisable to me. And so, I really enjoyed this book. I like novels that are kind of condensed like this into just 2 days, and this certain group of characters and their kind of interplay with one another. And yeah, I liked where it ended. I would read whatever this author had brought out in the future. Then, this is very rare for me, especially to be putting it at the end of the video of books I really enjoyed. I read Experience by Kate Young. This is a rom-com. Now, I have read very few rom-coms or romance novels. When I read them, I usually really enjoy them, in that I don't read novels that are super pacey very often. And so usually if I pick up a rom-com or a romance, I read it in one sitting, and I kind of love that. But inevitably I find a lot of it quite cringe and kind of predictable and annoying. And then when I finish the book, after that kind of high of reading it super fast, I'm kind of left feeling a bit like, oh, that was kind of frustrating. But when I heard about the premise of this book and the response it was getting from reviewers, I was like, I'm going to give this one a go. And I had a blast with it. I think this is probably as much as I could enjoy this type of novel. I really enjoyed it though. So if you are someone who does read romance novels, then definitely read this one. And if you're someone who doesn't, and is someone like me who mainly reads literary fiction but would like to maybe read some books that are just kind of easier to read, fun to get through, but still really well written and still dealing with the themes really well, I would definitely recommend this. Now, I think a really big plus for me is that this is a queer novel, and I haven't read many lesbian romance novels, and that would just be my preference to read in terms of romance novels. So I think that was definitely one thing. But I think regardless of that, she just did an amazing job with this book. I thought the writing was great, the character work was great, the tension was great, the level of comedy was really good. I sometimes find in romance novels, when an author's writing a character who's supposed to be kind of funny or clumsy or something, it inevitably ends up feeling really cringe, they're not funny when they're supposed to be or something. But this really worked for me. So what's this book about? This book follows Bet, who is in her early 30s. She has, in the last few months, come out as queer and fell very quickly into a relationship with a woman called May. They've been together a couple of months. She's feeling like she's falling in love with May. And the book opens when they've just had a great night of sex. And May turns around to Bet and says, I think we should take a 3-month break, because I feel like you haven't had an opportunity to live your free queer life, and I feel like I'm robbing you of that. So I think you should have 3 months where you go and have all the one-night stands you want, experiment as much as you want with other women, and if after that you still want to come back to me, then we'll get back together. And what Bet hears when May says that is, you don't think I'm experienced enough in the bedroom, and so you want me to go and learn stuff and then come back to you. I don't really want to do that, but in order to keep you, I will. And so you then follow Bet as she starts going on some dates and trying out one-night stands and seeing how that goes. The journey is brilliant. Very quickly, on the first date, Bet goes on a date with a woman called Ruth, and it's going really well, and then Bet kind of explains the situation, and Ruth is really disappointed, and she says, look, I am looking for something serious. My heart can't take the sort of thing you're asking me to be involved in, and I just think you need to be upfront about that on this dating app, because lots of women will be up for a one-night stand, but you just need to tell them that, because otherwise it kind of sounds like you're using them. Bet's like, oh my God, yeah, you're completely right. So she changes that, but her and Ruth become friends, and you sort of follow as through Ruth, Bet meets lots of other queer women and queer non-binary people, and yeah, just kind of goes on these one-night stands, some of which are super sexy, really well written in terms of sex scenes, because I think most of the time they can be cringe. They're not in this book at all. Some really awkward one-night stands, and I really appreciate that as well, because I think a lot of the time in these romance books, everything goes brilliantly, and that is not true. That is not what would happen. And lots of scenes just about her friendship with Ruth, her friendship with her old friends, with her housemate, and there's a really good tension about this kind of quest that May has sent her on, and I just really enjoyed it. I just had a great time with it. It to me, this wasn't just a romance novel. It was a really good book about friendship, in particular about people in their 30s who maybe kind of still live as housemates and are childless and are kind of trying to figure their way around. and I really enjoyed it. I would highly recommend it. I will read whatever this author writes in the future. Now we're on to the final book. This one will definitely end up being one of my favourite books of the year because it was, just a joy to read, but it's going to be really hard for me to talk about, so wish me luck. And that is The Circle by Catherine of Vermette. Now this is the third book in a trilogy of books. The first one is The Break, the second is The Strangers. Like I said, this is the third. Now the publisher and the author say that these books can be read as standalones or out of publication order. And I think that is true, but I wouldn't recommend it at this point because I think that this book has, about 20 viewpoint characters. So each chapter is from a different perspective. And I think without knowing these characters from the previous two books, you'd really struggle to follow how they were all linked together because a lot of them are related or know one another in different contexts. And I think you'd also struggle to feel truly connected to them because just spending 20 pages with a character, even if they're in a really difficult situation, isn't the same as knowing about their history when you read about them in a much longer form novel. So I would recommend reading them in order. And I want to describe this book in a way where you can know what this is about, but you're not spoiled about anything in the previous two, which is going to be a little bit difficult. So I'm going to have to kind of briefly explain the premises of the previous two without spoilers. There will be no spoilers here. The Break, all of these novels are set in Winnipeg, and all of these novels focus around Métis characters, predominantly Métis women and non-binary characters. And we predominantly follow two families. So in the first book, a young girl is brutally assaulted, and we are watching the fallout of that. Predominantly, we follow all the women in her family. As I said, they are a Métis family. We are looking at how they provide care and love and compassion for one another. This book is filled with trauma, in particular that looks at intergenerational trauma and just the complete failure of the local and governmental systems for Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous women and children. And this book is really traumatic and upsetting, very sad, but filled with hope and love through the characters. The second book is following a family called the Strangers, who were sort of referenced in that first novel. And it's told from three perspectives, two daughters and their mother, and none of them are able to currently see one another because their mother lost custody of them when they were younger, and they're all kind of split up. That's as much as I'll say. This book links all those characters back together, and those characters are all linked by this kind of horrible incident. And this book examines how all those characters deal with one of those central characters going missing. I think I managed to say all that without spoiling anything. And I think this is where I should probably read you a section of the blurb because I think it can do a better job than I can. Told from various perspectives with an unforgettable voice for each chapter, the novel masterfully parallels a restorative justice circle where all gather, both the victimised and the accused, to take account of a crime that has altered the course of their lives. And so, this book is examining the idea of a restorative justice circle. And like it says, each chapter is from a different perspective. It does a brilliant job of that. I loved getting all the loose ends tied up with these characters. I love getting to spend more time with people I'd loved and adored in the previous books, even if they are people who have done heinous things, and also seeing some more characters who are kind of added to this story. I think if you enjoy the previous two books, you'll really enjoy this. I do think this is the weakest. The other two were like an easy 5-star. This is probably like a 4.5 star. My very small criticisms with this are that I think a few characters could have been shaved from this. There's a couple of characters who are clearly there to give context. An example of that would be is that there's one character who's a journalist who specialises in gang culture, and for a lot of years he's been researching an Indigenous gang that work in the area, and they're kind of an important part to the novel, and he kind of explains how this type of gang comes to be and how they work and how they operate. And then there's another character who explains what a restorative justice circle is. So there's these characters who who don't really add much other than explaining things. And I still think she does a really good job of discussing a lot of important themes with subtlety. But because of the addition of those couple of characters, I felt this book was a little less subtle than the previous two. And yeah, I think it still avoided those kind of monologues we sometimes get in books about socio-economic issues, socio-cultural issues. But I think it went a little bit closer to that than I would have liked. So yeah, this was the weakest of the three, but I still really enjoyed it. I will read whatever this author brings out. I think she is a wonder, and I think the way she writes about forgiveness and anger and intergenerational trauma and love is profound. And her books deal with really upsetting things, but I think there's always an ease to her writing style. She feels entirely comfortable. I really trust her. Even those couple of characters where I mentioned I'd, not mind if they were kind of omitted, I still truly believed in their stories and could picture everything she was describing in their chapters. So yeah, I would really recommend that you read this trilogy. I think it's a brilliant collection of books. And yeah, I had a great time reading it. So that is everything I have read recently. Like I said, quite a few duds, but there was also a few that I really enjoyed. And I'm kind of, I kind of am happy to read a certain amount of duds to get to the books I really enjoy. But I just like the scales to be weighted slightly differently. So I am going to be really thoughtful about my reading going forward in the year. And yeah, try not to get swept up in reading something just because it's a new release, and actually be more selective and pick books that I really think I've got a really high chance of enjoying. So hopefully I'll be coming to you in future videos just talking like I did for the last few books, and that would be lovely. So yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts if you've read any of these or if you plan to read any of these. And as always, I'll be interested to know what you've been reading, if you have any recommendations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.